I'm Chuck Stroger, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our second Friday seminar. Before I introduce Lisa Stampnitzsky, let me try not to choke on my carrot. I was just reminded that there have been a couple of changes in the seminars for the rest of the semester. So is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks we have Josh? 2 weeks is Josh Frelich. Then after that is Bruce Hoffman is going to come next semester, not this semester because he, for various personal reasons, book Enemies Within, about the story of the NYPD intel surveillance of Muslims in New York, and the whole story. It's a wonderful, very interesting book. And then the last, am I forgetting somebody? No, then the last seminar on December 5th is going to be with Tore Bjorgo. Is Tore here? He was going to come, maybe he's going to come late, who's a visiting scholar from Norway on sort of how terrorism works and various things, and also reporting on some developments in Europe. So, and we have Lisa's booked for sale there after the seminar when we'll have our reception, and anybody can, it's right here, anybody can buy it for a cut rate price of $32, but it will be available. So Lisa is currently a lecturer at Harvard in social studies, and has got her Ph.D. from Berkeley, and this is her first book, Disciplining Terror, How Experts Invented Terrorism, with terrorism in quotation marks, which is an interesting part of the whole story, to have terrorism in quotation marks. And it's part of what she calls the sort of sociology of knowledge, and this sort of production of knowledge about terrorism, which has been very much a part of university life for, well, particularly ever since 9/11, although in her book, and I'm sure in her talk, she takes it back quite a bit further than that. And it's a fascinating book, and I think it makes, for those of us, all of us, who have some direct or indirect relationship to either terrorism or the study of terrorism or counterterrorism or interest in it, it invites us to reflect on the nature of our project and our relationship to the project in sometimes some rather startling questions that she raises about our endeavor. So, Lisa, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So as you just heard, my talk today is on the subject of how political violence became terrorism, and it's drawn from my book, Disciplining Terror. So this project began after 9/11. It began with my attempt to make sense of the American response to that event. Why, I wanted to know, why did the concept of terrorism so quickly come to dominate American understandings of the attacks? Why terrorism and not any other topic, any other potential framing, such as crime or madness or guerrilla warfare? And how and why did this concept of terrorism seem to exert so many peculiar effects on the public debate? Most strikingly, why did it seem as if the question of the causes of 9/11 and of terrorism more broadly had become almost unspeakable? So my talk today is going to first explain this first shift, how political violence became terrorism, and then second, identify some of the effects of that shift. So the core of my argument is as follows. First, I argue that this framework of terrorism is socially constructed. It's not natural or necessary. As I will show, similar acts of political violence could, and indeed were, previously understood in very different ways. And so I thus begin with the observation that the framing of violence as terrorism was socially and historically constructed, and then proceed by tracing how this happened. How did the terrorism framework emerge and displace prior framings? Second, my argument is not just that the problem of terrorism is socially constructed, but that the specific way that terrorism took shape as an object of knowledge has had significant effects. And I'm going to highlight two right now. One is that first, the key question about any act of violence will become, is this terrorism? And the answer to that question is then going to determine our subsequent responses. So for example, after the Boston Marathon bombings last year, one of the first questions that arose in the public debate was, is this terrorism or not? And that framed the immediate responses. Similarly, we can also ask, why are some events framed as terrorism and others are not? So we could say, why were the Boston Marathon bombings framed as terrorism, but for example, school shootings, like the large shooting in Sandy Hook, Connecticut last year, was not framed as terrorism? And my goal here, however, is not to get into this debate over why some events get framed as terrorism and some don't. This question of whether or not an incident really is terrorism or not. But just to ask and point out that the fact that this is the question that frames our debates about acts of violence. Is this terrorism or not? Because we can imagine an alternate reality, and in fact, you could go back several decades, and that would have been the reality, in which incidents of mass violence, shootings or bombings or whatever, would not necessarily have been framed in terms of this question, but in terms of a different discursive framework overall. Second, the framing of political violence as terrorism, I argue, affects how we speak about violence and who is authorized to speak about violence. And I argue that both expert and popular discourse on terrorism have come to be characterized by what I call a politics of anti-knowledge. And what I mean by this is a refusal of explanation itself, in which rational and scientific forms of explanation become opposed to explanation via terrorism as caused by an inexplicable evil. And I'll get into this a bit more as I get into the talk. But just to give an illustration at the very start, one really dramatic illustration of this phenomenon of what I call anti-knowledge happened last year, just after the Boston Marathon bombings. Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper publicly denounced calls to find the root causes behind the attack. And he declared, "This is not a time to commit sociology." When you see this type of violent act, he proclaimed, you do not sit around trying to rationalize it or make excuses for it or figure out its root causes. Even more to the point, one of his deputies then went on the news and said, well, the cause of terrorism is terrorists. And if that's your logic, the cause of terrorism is terrorists, then there's no need for expertise at all because that's your entire answer. So this is sort of a puzzle. What is going on here where we're eliminating any need for explanation beyond that? This notion of anti-politics draws on anthropologist James Ferguson's idea of, anti-knowledge draws on an earlier notion of anti-politics developed by the anthropologist James Ferguson. And he uses this to talk about a situation in which you can't, certain types of political explanations are excluded from the discourse. And what I'm saying here is not that you can't talk about things in a political way, but certain types of expert knowledges are excluded from the discourse. So not that experts control what's going on, it's not that technical experts are technocrats and they're controlling our response, but in fact that expertise is actually marginalized and is prevented from making as much of an intervention as it might. And I'll give a number of quotes and evidence from the research I did to back this up. In the situation of the anti-knowledge, therefore, what happens is that knowing terrorists becomes prescribed. It's as though this language of evil surrounds the problem of terrorism and creates a black box around it, around the terrorist, and this creates its own explanation. Terrorism is caused by terrorists. And further, terrorists commit terrorism because they're evil. Furthermore, if terrorists are evil, and that's the reason why we have terrorism, then one perhaps even should not seek to know anything more about them. So, to give you a brief overview of the rest of the talk, I'll first briefly discuss my methods and data for doing the research. I'll then present some further evidence to illustrate that the terrorism discourse, and specifically the debates right after 9/11, were indeed characterized by what I'm calling this taboo on explanation. And then I'll go on to answer the question of how this taboo on explanation arose. I'll trace how political violence turned into terrorism, and then what were the effects of this transformation on knowledge production more generally. So I began this project after 9/11, and I wanted to do a mapping of the history and structure of what I was calling the field of terrorism expertise. I come out of sociology, studied sociology of knowledge, and I was expecting to find something sort of like the other scientific disciplines that sociologists have studied, like the field of physics or the field of biochemistry or sort of any other scientific discipline where you can sort of map it out and see where the boundaries are and see what the accrediting agencies are, see what the status is within the field. But the thing is that it very quickly became apparent as I was doing the research that this is not what the production of knowledge of terrorism looked like. It didn't look like one of these, sort of typical scientific fields that sociologists tend to study. So what was happening that it didn't look like this? One is that, first of all, the terrorism experts, it became very clear, themselves do not control the scope of the debate. Furthermore, there is not any agreement on who gets to be a terrorism expert. Even if you ask experts themselves, they won't agree what it means to be a terrorism expert and who is and is not an expert. Furthermore, because one of the key questions of my research project was how are terrorism experts defined and who gets to determine who gets to be a terrorism expert, this created sort of a methodological problem because I couldn't just go in and impose my own definition of who is a terrorism expert onto the project because that would be answering my question before I even did the research. But then how do you study something if what you're studying is how does something get to be defined if you can't define it in advance? It's sort of a tricky puzzle in doing a research project. So what I did is I developed a number of methods of research that would allow me to sort of inductively and empirically get a sense of what's going on in the field and what has been happening here, and from that then develop an idea of what the structure looked like. And so empirically what I did is I started out by looking at the history of conferences on terrorism. I collected reports from 150 conferences from 1972 up until 2001. And I used these to start tracking who was speaking about terrorism as an expert, who was organizing the conferences, what kind of questions were people asking, and to map how did the field grow and how was the discourse changing over time. Once I'd done that, I did archival research. I looked into significant organizations, government committees, and individuals. And I also did interviews with over 30 individuals who have done research on terrorism, including some of those who historically were some of the earliest and most significant in the development of the field. And all of these empirical methods I synthesized in order to try to answer the questions that I've just introduced. Where did this problem of terrorism come from? How did political violence become terrorism? And why did it seem to drive people to talk about the problem in such peculiar ways? So I'm going to speak now to the question of what I'm calling this taboo on explanation. In the days, weeks, and months following the attacks of 9/11, Americans' attempts to understand what had happened seemed to boil down to one question, which would be repeated again and again. Why do they hate us? And while this question might, in theory, have been answered in many different ways, there was one response that seemed to proliferate above all others. And this was that there were no real reasons, at least none that were rational or understandable. So you heard, they hate us for our freedoms. They hate us for who we are. My absolute favorite example of this comes from the records of a meeting with Muslim community leaders at the White House, held on September 26, 2011. At this meeting, President Bush declared, "I consider bin Laden an evil man. This is a man who hates freedom. This is an evil man." This is the sort of thing you would expect to hear from the Bush administration. Then one of the attendees posed a question to him. He said, "Well, but does he have political goals?" And to which the president could only reply, "He has got evil goals. And it's hard to think in conventional terms about a man so dominated by evil." Public discussion about the attacks swiftly came to be dominated by this language of evil. Alternate approaches, especially those that sought to connect the attacks to U.S. foreign policy, tended to be marginalized. In one of the most well-known such incidents, when Susan Sontag would write in The New Yorker, just weeks after the attacks, that, quote, "This was not a cowardly attack on civilization, or liberty, or humanity, or the free world, but an attack on the world's self-proclaimed superpower, undertaken as a consequence of specific American alliances and actions, She was called deranged, an ally of evil, morally obtuse, and accused of hating America and the West and freedom and democratic goodness. And what was so strange here, I argue, is not just that there was a reflexive attack on someone who seemed to be presenting an unpopular opinion right after the country had been attacked, right? That's not that surprising. What was surprising is that there seemed to be resistance to anyone who tried to present any sort of causal argument at all. Furthermore, the thing is, this wasn't just an attack on writers who would say things in the New Yorker or in the political realm. This is something that impinged upon the realm of expertise and terrorism experts themselves, and this is what I find so interesting. This same taboo on discussing causation has affected experts. Experts on terrorism who sought explanations for the attacks and who highlighted the need to understand the motivations of terrorists were often viewed with suspicion. So, for example, political scientist Martha Crenshaw would recall that people in the government would feel mostly indignant. They would get upset when you said that you have to understand the motivations of terrorists. So here you have someone who's done many years of research on terrorist organizations, trying to talk to people in the government about what's happened, what are the causes of this, and saying that she's getting pushback about the very idea that we should be talking about causes at all. One of the most common threads that came up in my interviews that I did with these experts is that there's a paucity of studies based on contact with those who are labeled terrorists, that much of the research and the literature in the field is based on what some might call armchair research, right? Sort of doing research based on library work or government documents and not actually getting out into the field and getting firsthand knowledge. So for example, one of the founders of the field, Brian Jenkins, who worked at many years at RAND, which is a government think tank, he once compared terrorism experts to the Victorian cartographers of Africa. He says, just as the cartographers a century ago mapped from a distance a vast and impenetrable continent few of them had ever seen, most contemporary terrorism research is conducted far removed from, and therefore with little direct knowledge of, the actual terrorists themselves. Even at times, it could even seem that knowledge about terrorism could seem to be an impediment to getting ahead in the field. One of my interviewees related to me this anecdote of talking to two advisors to a government counterterrorism expert. And he said, I asked these guys, sort of, how did you get into the field? How did you get your job? And he said, they told me, oh, we had the only qualification this person wanted. We knew nothing about terrorism. And so in order to get a job working for a government counterterrorism advisor, they said we had to not have any background in the subject, which is kind of paradoxical. And, this might be an extreme case, but the fact that he chose this story to lead off with and to tell me, suggests that it resonated with him on some level. And so I want to know, how did we get to this point, this taboo on explanation? And my argument is that the taboo is an effect of the transformation of political violence into terrorism. The terrorism discourse, which framed Americans' responses to the 9/11 attacks, first began to take shape over the course of the 1970s, and I'm going to tell how that happened. Over the course of that decade, understandings of political violence, including hijackings, assassinations, and other acts that we would now clearly refer to as terrorism, shifted from being understood through a discourse of insurgency and counterinsurgency, in which violence was generally understood to be purposeful, rational, even sometimes justifiable, to a discourse that was dominated by this concept of terrorism, in which acts that were labeled as terrorism came to be seen as tainted and irrational and fundamentally immoral. Furthermore, as the problem of terrorism came to be understood, it came to be linked to an identity of the terrorist, rather than just a tactic that any group might adopt. And this is significant because once a group is labeled as terrorist, that label tends to stick. Whereas if it's just a tactic, you can say, okay, X group engaged in terrorist activities, but then maybe they stop and then they're no longer engaging in terrorist activities. Whereas now, once a group is labeled terrorist, that label sticks, and then even if they stop using violence, they still have that label on them. Furthermore, as I've suggested in the opening, this identity came to almost contain its own explanation. Terrorists are evil, irrational actors, And their action is driven not by normal interests or political motives, but instead by their very nature. And so, how did this change occur? What happened that we had this shift? A crucial turning point, I argue, dates to the early 1970s, with the rise of a seemingly new sort of political theatrical violence, which we can say is exemplified by the media-centric hijackings and hostage-takings perpetrated by Palestinian nationalists. Now, political violence against civilians, of course, was not new. Even hostage-taking, even hijacking, these were not new tactics. But what was new here was that you had nationalist and anti-colonial groups engaging in violence that transgressed geopolitical boundaries in new ways. So, for example, while previous anti-colonial violence, such as in Algeria, had tended to be local, the violence against civilians and against the military was occurring within the territory under contention. The new political theatrical violence that started to take shape in the early 1970s crossed national boundaries. In fact, it often targeted sites of transnational movement as their very targets. So, for example, they would target international airliners. And one of the incidents that I'm going to argue is a key turning point was the Olympics. The 1972 Olympics attack has been pointed to by many terrorism experts as this is when we first started to see terrorism as a problem. On September 5th, 1972, 8 members of the Palestinian nationalist group Black September entered the dormitory at the Olympic Stadium of the Israeli athletes. They killed 2 and they took 9 others hostage. The subsequent crisis would reverberate around the world, broadcast live to an audience estimated at over 900 million viewers by the global media that had gathered for the Olympic Games. And so I'm pointing here to one particular event. But my argument is going to be not just that events themselves lead to these changes in framing and discourse, but that you have to think about the transformation as occurring through a combination of events and the subsequent struggles over how these events should be defined and over who gets to do the defining. And so what you have here are some of the ways that world leaders described the 1972 attacks right away. And as you can see, it's not necessarily through this language of terrorism right away. Some use the language of terrorism, but it wasn't even at that time clear what terrorism entailed or whether terrorism was indeed the proper framework for making sense of the events. The New York Times would write that yesterday's murderous assault in Munich plumbed new depths of criminality. World leaders condemned the attacks as insane terror, an insane assault, an abhorrent crime, and the work of sick minds who do not belong to humanity. In the US, President Nixon would condemn outlaws who will stop at nothing to accomplish goals. But this attack was different because it got the attention of the US and the US government. The US government started to act in ways that they hadn't in response to any other previous hijacking or any previous attack against civilians. Because you had this attack on the world stage against Americans and other Westerners, and an attack that was meant for a worldwide audience rather than just a limited local audience. What happened is that shortly after the attacks at Munich, President Nixon established a new body, a cabinet committee to combat terrorism. And this was the first US government committee ever specifically focused on this problem. By 1976, the State Department's Office of External Research was managing a $250,000 program of research and analysis on the subject. And so what you have here is, this is just a quick graph from Google Books showing the rise of writings about terrorism as compared to insurgency. The red line shows you insurgency and related terms appearing in books, and as you can see, it's pretty flat, it doesn't change that much, whereas the blue line is terrorism, and it surpasses the insurgency line and keeps surpassing it just at about 1972. So that's just a rough estimate. But that's just an illustration to show you what I'm going to be talking about here. So what happened is, within a space of a few years, starting in 1972, terrorism would be transformed from a topic with almost nothing written about it, and this pans out if you go and do searches in journals, in magazines, in academic writings. There's very little before 1972, and then it shoots up. And then it becomes, in the space of a few years, a problem in which around you have entire institutes, journals, and conferences. By 1977, there were at least 11 bibliographic catalogs that people had compiled to keep track of an ever-increasing number of publications on the subject. A few years after that, one observer would write that authors have spilled almost as much ink as the actors of terrorism have spilled blood. And so this is another measure. So I mentioned in the beginning that one of the first things I did was collect reports on conferences. And this is just showing you the rise in the number of people who had presented at terrorism conferences over time. The first terrorism conference ever was held in 1972. By 1978, you had over 400 different people who had presented on terrorism at these conferences. So from almost nothing, you have this pool of hundreds of people who are potentially terrorism experts. Furthermore, this wasn't just a quantitative increase, that you have very few people writing about terrorism and then you have a lot. Rather, I'd argue this is the start of an interconnected field. And this is something where you get relationships among people who are starting to take on a new identity, the terrorism expert. And I'm going to illustrate this very briefly with a couple of diagrams, which I put together based on a database of presenters at terrorism conferences. And this is going to show you the rise of these interconnections. These are network diagrams that basically are going to show you the rise of connections among terrorism experts. What you see here, the red dots on these images each indicate one conference. The black squares each represent one person who presented at a conference. And so this first slide is not that interesting because you have 3 separate events and then 3 separate pools of people presenting at them. And this is what the field looked like by 1973. Now, by 1975, you had 7 conferences. Again, the red dots are the conferences, and several hundred, well, over 100 presenters. And you start to have a few connections. So, what I want to point out to you is the connecting lines between the red dots. Again, it's not that interesting, but you start to have a little bit of connection. And then this is what the field looks like by 1976. And just to point out, I've removed the presenters who don't attend more than one conference, because what I'm interested in showing you are the rise of the connections. So it's going to look like there's fewer people on this next graph, but that's just because I'm only including now the people who are connections. So by 1976, you have almost all of the conferences that have happened so far are connected. And then by 1978, you have this field structure that looks like sort of a spider web. So just to show you that there's something happening here, and it's not just a rise of individuals, but that you have people talking to each other. You had people who were calling themselves terrorism experts, and sometimes, not without a touch of irony, starting to call themselves the terrorism mafia. And so I'm going to shift now, once that I've established that there was the rise of terrorism experts and new people and more people writing about terrorism over this time period, I'm going to shift from this sort of descriptive analysis to analysis of the shifts in how people were actually talking about terrorism and why the discourse changed, why I say that political violence became terrorism over this period of time. And so what you have here is a chart comparing the insurgency framework versus the terrorism framework. So my argument is that before the 1970s, attacks of political violence that we now call terrorism were largely understood through a framework of insurgency. And there were very different meanings attached to the insurgency framework as opposed to the terrorism framework. Even though the events that they're applied to, events like bombings, hijackings, assassinations, can appear very similar, the meanings that were applied to the events through the discourses of counterterrorism or counterinsurgency differ very much. They differ in the way they conceptualize the problem, they differ in how they understand the causes of the problem, and they differ in the potential responses that they suggest. Whereas the counterinsurgency discourse tended to conceptualize insurgents and counterinsurgents as parallel roles, the discourse on terrorism would be characterized by an ongoing tension over whether or not terrorists were necessarily evil, pathological, irrational actors, fundamentally different from us. And so that's what you see here, that if you ask the question of the discourse, are the people who are committing the violence, are they necessarily immoral? In the insurgency framework, and I'll give you some illustrations of this in just a minute, in the insurgency framework, they're not considered necessarily immoral. They might be doing the wrong thing, or they might be doing something that we can support. Whereas once the political violence becomes understood as terrorism, it is largely seen as immoral, and this is contested to some degree, which we can talk about, but the dominant understanding is that terrorism is necessarily immoral. Similarly, are these perpetrators thought to be rational actors? Within the insurgency framework, largely they're understood to be acting rationally. Whether or not we agree with what they're doing, it's thought that insurgents are acting rationally. Whereas, again, within the terrorism discourse, once political violence becomes terrorism, these people are thought to be largely acting irrationally. And again, this is contested, but I argue that there is a persistent strand of thought that they are acting irrationally. Finally, are the perpetrators thought to be acting on the basis of coherent political goals? When you're thinking about insurgency, yes, they absolutely are. Once political violence becomes terrorism, it's highly contested. There's a lot of argument as to whether or not terrorists can have goals, can have political goals that are meaningful, can have goals that we can understand. And so this sort of sums up why this shift is so important. I'm now going to give some examples and flesh out what I mean by this. Counterinsurgent writers frequently expressed a degree of respect for their opponents that would be quite unusual in the terrorism literature. So these counterinsurgency experts were writing to defeat insurgents. You know, they, for the most part, were not sympathetic to the insurgents, but they saw them as worthy enemies. So, for example, one of the classics of modern counterinsurgency is Modern Warfare by Roger Trinqueer. It was published in 1964, and as the preface to the book puts it, Trinqueer approaches the insurgents with the cold respect of a professional warrior. He describes an enemy who is deeply committed to his cause and ingenious in his pursuit. So within the counterinsurgency discourse, terror is viewed as just one stage within a broader process of insurgency or revolution. It's a stage through which groups could pass without necessarily permanently tainting their reputations. Terror or political violence was seen as a tactic rather than as an identifying feature of individuals or groups. This also meant that within the counterinsurgency literature, violence or terrorism could be seen as something that could be used either by insurgents, by sub-state groups, or by states. Another typical example of this can be seen in the report from a 1962 symposium held on counterinsurgency at RAND, which is a US government-funded think tank. Analysts at this conference did not reflexively condemn terrorism. They instead spoke of the possibility of using terror wisely and selectively. The report from this conference starts out by discussing structural problems that may lead to guerrilla movements in different parts of the world. Problems such as unemployment, inequality, and colonialism. An acknowledgement of the importance of a cause to insurgents and guerrillas was almost universal in this literature, and it imposed on counterinsurgency experts the importance of, as one put it, understanding insurgents' motives, their minds, and their mentality. Now, aspects of this insurgency framework, in which terror was seen as more of a tactic than a defining act, would carry over into the earliest expert analyses of terrorism in the US in the 1970s. The very first American Conference on Terrorism was held in 1972 at the State Department. And at this conference, according to the official report, there was a general consensus that, quote, nearly every variety of political and ethnic group is likely, under certain, generally desperate circumstances, to resort to terrorism. The experts at the conference furthermore agreed that terrorism is a tool not confined to opposition forces. It can also be applied by established regimes. And furthermore, they agreed that terrorism was the product of frustration induced by unresolved grievances. Similarly, a 1974 US government report would note that the US government recognizes the merit of elimination of causes of terrorism, including legitimate grievances which motivate potential terrorists. And I highlight that because it was unimaginable in the years after 9/11 to imagine the US government saying something like this. Not just that terrorism was caused by grievances, but that these grievances might even be legitimate. And what I'm arguing is that while this is the case in the very earliest years of the terrorism expert discourse in the early 1970s, by the mid to late 70s, this discourse has transformed in something that is much more like the situation that we have now, and that was present in 2001 that shaped American responses to the 9/11 attacks. By the mid-1970s, I'm going to show you, discussions of terrorism and discussions of terrorism among experts have begun to move away from this counterinsurgency influenced framework and towards a reconceptualization of terrorism as a practice that would define a certain type of actor, the terrorist. So in 1976, the State Department held a follow-up conference. And the report from this conference is very illuminating. You can compare the way that the experts spoke at this conference to the way they spoke 4 years earlier in 1972. Speakers at this conference tended to agree that terrorism was the activity of sub-state actors, not of states. They, quote, doubted that the direct causes of terrorism could be discovered in political or socioeconomic conditions, and they were skeptical of the argument that the way to stop terrorism was to remove its causes. So almost the complete opposite view of what experts had been saying 4 years earlier in 1972. At this conference, the question of whether or not terrorists could ever be freedom fighters was hotly debated, with the majority of the presenters arguing that the categories were mutually exclusive. And so, right, this is this question of, can a terrorist be a freedom fighter? And, you know, sort of you hear it tossed around today. It's a cliche. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And this points back to this notion that I referenced in the very beginning of the talk, that no one can agree on who is a terrorism expert. No one can even agree on who is a terrorist or not. But I'm not pointing this out to highlight that there's this disagreement over who is a terrorist and who's not a terrorist. I'm pointing this out to highlight that this shows that there was a shift in the way people talked about terrorists at this time. So in 1976, the experts are agreed that this is an opposition. You're either a terrorist, a bad guy, or you're a freedom fighter, a good guy. And you can't be both. You're one or the other, and we might argue over which box you get put into, but these are mutually exclusive categories. But the thing is, before this time, if you talked to the experts in the 1972 conference, or if you looked at the insurgency and counterinsurgency writers who were writing in the 1960s and earlier about political violence and political violence against civilians, this opposition would not have made any sense to them, because they would have said, well, yes, you can be a terrorist, one who engages in political violence and attacks against civilians, and you can be a freedom fighter, because a freedom fighter, that's a moral and a political judgment, whereas to say you're a terrorist is to say you use a certain kind of tactic. So that's what was the case before the mid-1970s. Whereas by the mid-1970s and beyond, and I would argue this is the situation that we're still in today, to say someone is a terrorist is to say that you are by definition not a freedom fighter. You are someone who we disagree with. And so it takes on this moral and political judgment inherent into the term. And so how did this transformation occur? This is the big puzzle. How do you get from 1972, when people are talking about terrorism as a tactic, to 1976, where you're talking about terrorism as something that is people that we find evil? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the developments that happened in the years in between them and identify some of the points at which we can see shifts occurring. We can see some of the beginnings of the transformation, I argue, in the form of an injection of demands for moral condemnation of terrorism and the opposition of explanation and moral judgment in a set of congressional hearings that were held in 1974 on the problem of international terrorism. And what you have here is some very interesting interactions between experts and researchers on terrorism and political violence and congresspeople. And you see sort of two sets of assumptions coming into clashing. And I'm going to argue that through this clash, the experts and others began to take account of the assumptions of the politicians to a certain extent. So I'll just read out a few excerpts from these hearings that illustrate, I argue, this injection of demands for moral condemnation into the discourse. So one witness who you see here on the left was Louis Hoffaker. And he was part of the cabinet committee to combat terrorism. So he himself was working within the government, but in a sort of bureaucratic role. And he, in his testimony, he cited the frustrations that feed terrorism. So this is this discourse of terrorism as caused by perhaps even legitimate grievances. He declared, "We are not unmindful of the various motivations, both real and conjured, of individuals and organized terrorist groups who have chosen terrorism as the way to attain their objectives. right? So he's here speaking from the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism and saying, here's how we understand terrorism. These are individuals and their groups. They have grievances. They may be real or they may not be, and they're choosing to use violence rather than some other sort of tactic to attain those goals. In response to this, you had Representative John Buchanan, who you see on the right. And he comes up and he says, I want to emphasize the importance of establishing terrorism as barbaric and unspeakable. He says, Mr. Ambassador, I think that there must be a way that we can establish an international climate in which barbaric acts of terrorism against innocent people will be treated by the world community as barbaric and as something that is simply an unspeakable policy in a civilized setting. He continues, I think only an unbalanced mind could conceive of acts of terrorism as an acceptable element of any kind of struggle. And so he's coming along and saying, you know, you're saying that there are causes and grievances, and I don't want to hear any of this. You know, these people are just sort of crazy and they don't have any real motivations. Similarly, you can see a similar pattern of contention in other interactions between witnesses and the members of Congress throughout the course of these hearings. During the testimony of Brian Jenkins, who I've mentioned already, who was the head of terrorism research at RAND, he got up in these 1974 hearings, and he began stating that terrorism is often described as mindless violence, senseless violence, or irrational violence. None of these adjectives is correct. He then went on to disavow both the idea that terrorist was a fixed identity and the idea that terrorism could be understood without a larger social or political context, declaring, I don't believe terrorists belong to a separate country of the world called terrorism, and therefore we can deal with them apart from various local struggles. Then another member of Congress then got up and questioned Jenkins. He asked, well, can governments commit terrorism? And Jenkins said, well, yes. Clearly displeased with this response, Representative Bingham, who you see again on the right here, replied, don't we perhaps need a different word for that? So again, you have here this moment of saying, the expert is saying, well, terrorism is political violence against civilians. It can be done by sub-state actors. It can be done by states. And then you have a member of Congress coming along and saying, I don't like that. You need a different word. And so this is this moment where things are being hashed out. And I've read to you, sort of these colorful excerpts because I see this as a key moment when pressure was being applied to alter the way that terrorism as a problem was being conceptualized. Not just who gets labeled as a terrorist, but the very meaning of what it is to call something terrorism or not. All right, so to sum up, what I've argued here is that terrorism first became an object of knowledge in the early 1970s, following the rise of what I have called political theatrical violence, or violence out of place. Over the course of that decade, there was a shift from understanding the problem of political violence through a discourse of insurgency, in which violent actors were portrayed as rational actors with coherent goals, which we may or may not condemn, to a discourse of terrorism, in which violent actors were understood as evil and irrational, both in their methods and in their ultimate goals. Integrally tied to this shift was the move from understanding terror as a tactic, which any group might employ, to thinking of terrorists as an identity, which defined those who engaged in it in very particular ways. And so, while within the insurgency framework, it was possible and even common to separate one's evaluation of the tactics that a group used from the evaluation of the goals that they wanted to achieve, with the rise of this terrorism framework, I argue, these two things become intertwined, the evaluation of the goals and the evaluation of the tactics. You can't speak about them separately. And so, as terrorism took shape as a way of understanding political violence, experts began to face increasing difficulty presenting themselves and their work as legitimate, yet also morally detached or separable from this object of terrorism. I have suggested that terrorism took shape as a problem that contained within it its own explanation. Terrorists are evil, and that is why they commit terrorism. Consequently, any broader attempt to explain political violence in other terms could be potentially dismissed as both pointless and morally suspect. And this is what I call anti-knowledge, this situation in which, in order to be a credible expert on the subject, one must not get too close to actual terrorists or to understanding their worldviews, lest one be deemed sympathetic and thus tainted, And you can see this in any of the examples of experts who today do try to do this, do try to understand what's going on. They're subject to discrediting attacks. And in order to maintain their credibility and authority, experts needed to maintain a certain distance from their very object of expertise, which I argue is a very peculiar situation. This taboo has shaped the production of knowledge on terrorism from the 1970s up until the present day. And I've started out with a couple of present day examples, but just to illustrate that this goes back quite a ways, I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay that was published in the New York Review of Books in 1979, which criticized terrorism experts for not being critical enough of terrorists. So the essay writes, the authors under review, who were researchers who had written books on terrorism, are social scientists who claim to be experts on terror and give advice on how to deal with it, yet it critiques them for having little patience for moral argument and for writing in a style such that their tone is casual and clear of indignation, concluding that the author's approach might not only excuse terrorism, but even provide a scientific rationale for it. So what are some of the implications of thinking about terrorism in this way? What I've argued is that the way that political violence has been constructed as terrorism has significant effects. And I've focused here on effects for the production of knowledge, or what I've called anti-knowledge, prevention of certain types of knowledge, and this taboo on explanation. Furthermore, this isn't just a rhetorical effect. This actually has direct implications for the sorts of policies that we can see implemented. Because if you think of your enemies as rational actors with coherent goals, right, one might choose simply to eliminate them, but one might also try to prevent violence in other ways, like removing their grievances, or convincing them to change their goals, or altering incentives in ways such that violence no longer seems like a useful way to attain those goals. And this is not to say that these approaches have not appeared at all in the context of the war on terror. You can see them emerging, for example, in the new counterinsurgency movement that was driven up by Petraeus and Kilcullen during the later years of the Iraq War. And they were advocating for this shift. And we can talk about the extent to which the counterinsurgency framework actually holds to those ideals, but ideally this is what they were arguing for. But the thing is, they were unsuccessful. The dominant logic of the war on terror has been to find and kill the bad guys, because that's all we can do. A second important effect of the construction of political violence as terrorism, I argue, is the very construction of terrorism as an object of truth. As I noted in the beginning, what happens is that every act of mass violence becomes subject to this question, was this terrorism? And the answer to that question, whether we decide this was terrorism or it's not terrorism, that then shapes how we interpret and respond to the event. But again, what if that wasn't the key question that was always asked? What if instead of asking whether X or Y or Z event was terrorism, we instead thought about violence problems, or we had another interpretive framework? One can imagine that we would have had very different sorts of policies than those that have emerged over the course of the war on terror. Finally, I argue that this case doesn't just tell us something about terrorism, but it also has implications for our understanding of the role of expert knowledge in politics and society more generally. At least since the work of Max Weber, who is a political and social theorist in the early 20th century, social scientists have analyzed what they call rationalization. And this is the idea that there's an increasing role of instrumental rationality, the development of expert knowledge and routines of action based on this expert knowledge that can increase predictability and that can make people, things, and problems subject to control. And that this is a constituent feature of the modern world, this particular form of rationality that has expertise as a particular role in it. Yet this problem of terrorism, I argue, at least as it's been constructed in the contemporary US, seems to elude rationalization. As I've shown in this talk, investigation into the causes of terrorism in a way that might enable this sort of rationalization has often been blocked by the insistence that terrorism is caused by evil, something which seems to have no solution except complete elimination. Furthermore, the problem of rationality in this study of terrorism is tied up with this dual meaning of reason, to think through and to provide explanations. And the refusal to consider terrorist attacks and terrorists themselves as potentially rational is the refusal to consider that those who we label terrorist might have reasons or rational explanations for their conduct, whether or not we judge those reasons to be worthy ones or not. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of Questions? Let me lead off with a question that I mentioned briefly at lunch, and that is whether whether starting in 1972 sort of brings it into the storyline that you tell, brings it into an immediate historical context that may leach out a long history that is worth pondering. And that, I would not say that terrorism as a human activity, as a form of political violence, is ontological, but I do think it's something that's a form of political violence that's taken shape historically over a really long, long period of time, with antecedents going back into the ancient world, some groups in the Middle Ages, like the Sicarii, that seem to be very much have echoes in present groups, to the word emerging in the French Revolution in quite a different context, but certainly, and this is what I'm talking about briefly at lunch, with the Russian terrorists in the 19th century, who have all the kind of hallmarks, that would, as it emerged as a term, marked as, I don't know the rhetoric of academics in Russia in the 19th century, but I'm pretty sure that it certainly had the labeling of being evil. It was across, you mentioned the example, the difference between Algeria and the FLN in the late 1950s and say Munich attacks in 1972, was that one was local and one was national. Well, in the 19th century, the Russian, particularly after the sort of transformative moment of assassinating the Tsar in 1881, Johann Most and Emma Goldman, they came to the United States. Emma Goldman met with Leon Czolgosz 3 weeks before he assassinated McKinley in 1901, so that it was very much, it was a concept, it was a practice, it was a tactic, it had organizational techniques, and it had a theory. So that the theory of propaganda by the deed, all of the sort of rationalizations, the Marxist theories, the anarchist theory that grounded the behavior, the tactics, and that form of political violence. I wonder historically whether it has a much longer history, and that we forgot it because between about 1914 and 1972, it receded from historical consciousness. We had 2 world wars. We had a lot of other forms of violence that engulfed us. And the post-colonial struggle was mostly insurgents. And so the whole, from in the 50s and into the early 60s, the kind of violence that might, in a different context, might have been labeled terrorism, was counterinsurgent because it had a very special kind of history. So from from the First World War until Munich, really we kind of forgot what had already been well underway in the 19th century. So that what emerged after, it's a fascinating story, particularly the transformative moment in 1974. That's really interesting. And I must say, for those of you in this seminar, many of those faces she had on the wall had been guests in this seminar, right? Including Martha Crenshaw and Brian Jenkins. And so you're all familiar with the cast of characters in this story. And that's a fascinating story, but it may be something very peculiarly Western and recent, and really may need to be embedded in this somewhat larger historical narrative.
Yeah, so thanks for those comments. I think one could argue and I think do a really interesting research project that is looking at the history and the movement and genealogy of tactics of violence and of understandings of those who, whether or not they call themselves terrorists, who engage in this sort of political violence that we now call terrorism. And I think you certainly would see many continuities there. I guess the reason why I argue for a break is that I'm writing not about the tactics themselves, but about the, precisely this Western interpretation of violence as terrorism, as a particular sort of thing. And I would say, one evidence of that, apart from, sort of the simple rise of a field of expertise, is that the meaning of the word terrorism itself shifts. So that before the 1970s, you have groups who, some of the groups you mentioned, who engage in this sort of tactical violence, who who would themselves claim the label of terrorist, right? So, for example, the Irgun, some of the Jewish insurgent groups in the pre-state, Palestine before the foundation of Israel called themselves terrorists. Whereas now, almost no group will themselves claim the label of terrorist. They will decry it because to call someone a terrorist is to say that you are in the wrong. And so what I see has shifted is not that groups are engaging in the tactical use of violence or certain forms of violence or even perhaps certain theories or tactical understandings of why one would use violence, but that what's shifted is counterterrorism, is the emergence of this demonization of some forms of violence and some actors as this untouchable category of terrorism. Of course, it's confusing because the word, as you mentioned, goes back to the French Revolution. But I would argue that there's been a real break and a real shift in the meaning of the concept in the 1970s.
Let's go to a student. Yes.
Thank you, both of you. But looking at the definition, I was thinking about the period after Reconstruction up to 1972, whenever you started this, and what happened here in this country, and looking at Klan activity and political violence there. So I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go to the period after the 70s, and I'm thinking of Timothy McVeigh and Oklahoma, and I'm wondering if he is considered as a terrorist within your definition.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess first, sort of to simply first answer, would I consider him a terrorist according to my definition? I don't have an answer to that because I myself don't impose my own definition of what terrorism is. I'm looking at
You're not a terrorism expert, right?
Right, because I'm not claiming myself to be a terrorism expert. But what do other people say? If you go back, as I did, and read, sort of the immediate debates after the Oklahoma City bombing, there were debates over was this terrorism or not. There came to be a consensus pretty quickly that it was. I mean, interestingly, part of the reason why people decided very quickly that this was terrorism was that there were rumors, one of them put forth by a sort of discredited terrorism expert, that this had been done either by Islamic groups or someone who had ties to Islamic groups, and that was discredited. But McVeigh did pretty clearly have the terrorist label put onto him. And the question of, why that stuck and why he was labeled as a terrorist successfully, I think we could, analyze interestingly. But I would say it seemed pretty clear in the unveiling of what happened after that attack that people decided he was, in fact, a terrorist.
Sorry.
You got to speak up.
I'm sorry, Jason, how are you?
Hi.
I know you talked, the rationale of terrorism, saying that what they do may not be bad. So my question is that maybe I misunderstood it. Do you consider like 9/11 like a rational reason for what they did?
So, I mean, that's a great question because there's two questions embedded there, right? One is, do I think that 9/11 was somehow justified? No, it was a horrible thing. Do I think that the people who committed 9/11 were acting rationally, meaning that in their own heads, they had reasons that made sense for what they did? I think they did. I mean, obviously, they're dead now and we can't ask them and we can't know for sure, but I would say, yes, it's likely that they were acting rationally in some way. Now, that doesn't mean that their reasons were reasons that any of us would agree with. But part of this struggle over the meaning of terrorism is this struggle over whether or not it's permissible, I would say, to say that people who commit acts that we may find really repellent, like 9/11, to then, can we say that they were in some way rational? And that struggle itself is part of the story that I'm telling.
What about all the emergency personnel that went down there and died down there?
That was horrible. I mean, again, I'm not saying that what happened there was justified or correct in any way. I'm just saying that, people often do things that are terrible, but that they have reasons for that we can disagree with.
Yes, I can't scream. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's really a fascinating talk, and this is an opportunity for us to reflect on us, which is really always a great thing to do. One thing that interests me in particular of your research is related to my research. In my analysis of Israeli dissertations on terrorism that are looking at the history of terrorism or are looking at contemporary terrorism, I see a distinct differentiation between historical terrorism that is being seen as insurgency and rational. And I find a theme of irrational aggression that I then track back to the images of the Arabs, or Professor Kumar is here, she will say Muslims, but I wonder how much the attribution of the abject, irrational and aggression is not really a resurgence of a narrative that is already primed in the Western mind of the Arab as being irrationally aggressive, dating back, of course, to the Crusades and whatnot. And in the 1972 midpoint is even another point in support of, or it seems like in support of that. I wonder what you think, because there is a confounding trend here of the rise of the Arab, and I'm saying Arab because we are talking both on Marxist-Leninist Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, and Muslim Palestinians all together. And I wonder how much you think this played a role in the transition of this irrational aggression.
Yes, I mean, that's a really interesting thing to bring out, because it's clear that if you look at the, sort of cultural logics that are underlying this idea of terrorism, they echo in many ways the frameworks that are applied, going back much before this to Arabs or to people from the East or the Orient. Now, I guess my question is, I don't know if that explains the rise of this terrorist notion. But you can't, deny that it's been disproportionately being applied to Arabs and Muslims, that the, sort of triggering events were conducted by Palestinian groups, and that part of the discourse on terrorism has been framed in terms of this notion of civilization or the West and so forth. I mean, I would say there are complicating factors here, one of which is that terrorist itself is, it's not, I would say this maybe has changed in the last 20 or so years, but at least in the first decade or couple of decades, it was not ever an explicitly ethnicized notion, and was applied to many people who were not ethnically other. But yet, even when it was applied to people who are white, right, it sort of retains those cultural notions that come out of that discourse for understanding Arabs. So I think that is really important, but it doesn't explain everything.
Terrorism
Yeah.
and immorality.
Yes.
I mean, as you said before, the Irgun or many others like call themselves terrorists openly.
They did.
Proudly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the shift. Yeah.
Go.
Oh, yeah. So it's a multi-part question that they're all related and they're quick. So one question is, when you talk about moral, I'm not entirely clear on what you mean, because it seems like you're almost talking about it as though it's synonymous with irrational or senseless. And to me, for something to be senseless or irrational, I think of that as, depending on how the terms are being used, amoral as opposed to moral. And in fact, when you talked about the 9/11 attacks as being terrible, which I'm sure, I'm guessing all of us here would agree with, I mean, that's a moral assessment as opposed to the assessment that it's just simply senseless, right? And then, so you talk about the dominant framework changing mid-1970s, and as I understand you, there's a couple points you're making about that. One is that it's the point about morality, and the other point is about the extent to which, or at least these are the 2 points that loom most clearly in my mind. The other point was about the extent to which people are willing to consider state violence as terrorism, or to consider them all as part of one category. And I just wonder, so pre-mid-1970s, if we're talking about bombings in Germany, if we're talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the dominant discourse pre-1970s really that you would consider that as violence in the same way that you consider what we now think of as terrorist violence as violence? So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit on that. I'm skeptical about whether, in fact, that dominant discourse that we identified pre-1970s was actually a dominant discourse. And then related to that, post-mid-1970s, I mean, I don't know. On the one hand, I hear the media discourse and political discourse about terrorism being senseless, but I also hear, discourses about, the goal being to establish Sharia law throughout the Middle East and beyond, right? That's rational, right? That's goal-oriented, rational in the sense of being that. And then on your violence framework, I'm wondering how far you're willing to take that, because one of the things that I'll talk about in my criminology classes, right, is the notion of violence and how the term is socially constructed, which you quite rightly emphasized. But under a dictionary definition of violence, I mean, simple arrests, right, stops and frisks, you name it, right, no matter what it's in response to, even if it's perfectly justified, is violence, right? So what does it mean to move towards a violence framework? What does that encompass and what does that sorry.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and address all of those. So I guess starting at the beginning, I think the idea that moral and irrational are separate things and should be separated, you're absolutely right. And I think I may have conflated them because the terrorism discourse itself tends to conflate them, but conceptually they should be separated. I think I highlight this sort of the morality, the injection of morality, particularly because historically, or at least ideally, whether or not this has been the case in practice, ideally there's been an ideal of science and the production of scientific knowledge as an amoral pursuit, right? That one can study things and be detached from a judgment of whether or not you think something is right or wrong. That doesn't mean that you can't have judgments about whether they're right or wrong, but that those are separate from your production of scientific knowledge, right? So, and again, sort of in practice, maybe things don't always work out as in the ideal type, but that's the ideal type. So for example, if I look at the insurgency framework, those who were experts writing about insurgency often would have had moral judgments about the people they were writing about, but those were not intertwined with their production of quote-unquote expert or scientific knowledge about why and how insurgency happens in the way that now happens with terrorism. So it's a shift in how the things are interconnected.
But even Weber would say that the value is lurking in the background somewhere, even if we've forgotten what it is, right? There's a value there.
Oh yeah, there's always value there, but the question is there this ideal of separating out sort of the value sphere from the production of rational knowledge, and whether or not they're always intertwined or not, there's still sort of this ideal, whereas I would say now they're sort of pushing back in this case against this separation in some ways, which is sort of peculiar given that the usual, sort of the usual ideal is that scientific knowledge should be completely detached. So that's the reason why I sort of make that point. I guess so your question about violence before the 1970s, I'm not quite clear what you were asking there. Were you asking if things like Hiroshima would have been understood as insurgency?
Yeah, so, I heard you to be suggesting that there wasn't, among the experts and possibly people in the American government, there wasn't this neat separation of, one kind of violence versus another kind of violence based on who's engaging in it. And if we're talking about, let's say, military intervention in Germany in World War II, is it really the case that we're thinking, oh, that's violence just like that other kind of violence? Right.
Yeah, so I wouldn't take it quite that far. I think I'm making a much more limited claim, which is that when talking about, sort of what you might call sub-state, sort of limited violence against civilians, right? Sort of the way, like sort of a common sense definition of terrorism. That when you're talking about those sorts of activities, there wasn't this distinction. I think when you're, talking about warfare, that's a whole other set of arguments. Although, I think, even when you go back to World War II, I looked at some interesting documents, sort of looking, Army documents talking about insurgency in the context of World War II. And one of the really interesting things there is that they write about insurgency as it's actually considered quite positive, right? Because the insurgents during World War II were the partisans; they were on our side. And then you have manuals, military manuals, that are advising U.S. military personnel as to whether or not they can sometimes engage in terrorism. So this word terrorism was used to talk about this sort of insurgent violence, but it didn't have the resonances that it does today, of course, because you would never have a manual today that would advise U.S. military personnel to engage in terrorism using that language. And then your final, let's see, you had a final question that was about, I'm sorry.
Suggested violence.
Oh, and so, I mean, I think that's not, yeah, so I can't sort of explicate on that because it's not, I'm not putting forth a program that's really fleshed out. That was just to say that hypothetically, we can imagine an alternate framework in which violence is talked about in a different way. And of course, violence is itself something that is politically and socially constructed. And, I think any alternate framework would have just as many difficulties in terms of, sort of ambiguities and so forth that the terrorism framework would have, but there would be different problems that might have different consequences. That's all.
A few things that occurred to me of what the doctor.
Can you hear him in the back?
Can you hear me now? Okay. A few things that Dr. Strozier said that I felt stand out in some of the things that you said. Obviously, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Joseph and his wife is the archetypal example of what you're talking about, both in terms of perception and mechanics. So the entire cosmology of the voice, I think, is very valid. Certainly, as Dr. Strozier says, it predates. The whole way that was portrayed, that it kicked off World War I and it being outside of national boundaries, is a quintessential example. Further, the British would have portrayed the American revolutionaries in that manner. And Cromwell, in his second Irish campaign, when he massacred the Irish Catholics, did so because of the prior claimed massacres of the Protestants. You talked about, once you're taught that the terrorist thing is forever, but yet I can make a counter argument. What are they talking about ISIS as freedom fighters in 2012, 2013, when Assad was the enemy? We want to arm them. Now, it is evident it is fluid. The notion of the Arab, the other, that Dr. Cohen spoke about, certainly that was used against us Jews in Germany. It is the non-white person. The one wants to talk about amoral actions that make, in a sense, no sense, except perhaps for personal
And
gain.
it was used against the Teutons by the Scandinavians in the 13th century.
And against the other.
The Teutons as the dark and irrational.
Well, also, I think we also have to differentiate between what the groundlings are told, the common people, and what is being thought by the people who are lining this up. The Bin Ladens are a business conglomerate. I doubt that he was really as fanatical as the people who committed the atrocity. I think these people think in terms of dominant spears, oil. Certainly, we want to talk about amoral plunder. What Bush and his cronies did when they went in there and killed, even go to avenge 911 or whatever, 200,000, 300,000 Muslims died in this process. And they really wanted something, whether it was position, territory, oil. Similarly, Leopold and in the Belgian Congo, what the Brits did in India, or what the Brits and the French did to the Muslims for 150 years in the Middle East. And the tribal rivals of Sunni Shia, their own. I think two other variables you may want to get into that I think the cosmology is good, but you're not talking about business and media, which are also variables. And that's it.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Could we sort of, have a bunch of
Collect a few?
comments?
Yeah.
You don't have to answer everything. but
Okay.
that kind
And then I'll
of
try
brings
to
more people
answer,
into the conversation.
highlights.
Right. Bruce, and then
Thinking about anti-knowledge and its place in government, and thinking about if academia is partly to blame for this stance, that we've got decades-long investigation into political violence in terms of terrorism or not terrorism, or violence theories, and still haven't come up with a coherent theory. Doesn't that play a role in the government's ability to ignore the research?
to do what?
To ignore the research.
Ignore the
Because you can't show that there's anything there.
Yeah.
I had a question about the British experience. You must have done some comparatives, but I mean, after 9/11, Blair, they totally incorporated Bush's rhetoric. But previous to that, of course, Britain had the IRA issue. In there, what was the discourse about the IRA about terrorism? I can't imagine in that period anyone in Britain who was an expert on Irish history would reinvent themselves as terrorist experts. So I was wondering what sort of conferences were out there.
Yeah, David.
You mentioned, you trace a little bit of the current, well, rather recent discourse on evil, the Bush administration and all that. And I'm wondering if you take that further back in the book at all, and kind of, do a genealogy a bit on that. Where does this evil discourse come from? And is there do you have any thoughts about why it resonates so well today?
Can I add something about evil? It moves, it seems to me, historically. The discussion of terrorism moves into a discourse of evil when the nature of the violence shifts from more familiar kinds of motivated left-wing violence, PLO, IRA, to more religiously based forms of violence that evoke that response of evil, so that the nature of the aspirations are justified, bin Laden's fatwas, are justified in a context in a religious context. And therefore that evokes Bush's first response to fight a crusade and axis of evil and it's evil. And once you're into that cycle of moralizing, it then opens up a whole new form of response, which as the violence is open-ended, the new kind of violence, religiously based because God is telling you what to do and you're justified, the response can be open-ended and lead to vast wars and militarizing counterterrorism and plays on a kind of a psychological response, it seems to me, that if your opponent is evil, then that lends, it creates the possibility of totalizing the other as being the embodiment of danger and evil, and therefore it creates a kind of a paranoid response, and not only the possibility of the right to dispense with them, but even the obligation to dispense with them, so that you have a kind of a cycle in which the violence evokes a response, which then enhances makes it more likely to lead to extreme, as we saw, in the decade after 9/11, fighting two wars to eradicate evil, in a kind of a paranoid way, and you end up with a kind of an apocalyptic dance between Bush and Bin Laden.
So I'll respond to a couple of things. I guess on this question of evil, I think there was a real shift in the 1990s. People started talking about this idea of new terrorism that was religiously driven, that was more irrational, that was perhaps, sort of, I think, and the, sort of valence of the discourse became more extreme in terms of talking about terrorism as a more extreme threat. But one of the really interesting things is that if you go and look at what people were writing in the 1990s, and then I'd argue it's sort of congruent with what you see after 2011, but just sort of more louder, they're saying things like, the terrorism that we have now is worse than what we had in the 1970s. Those groups in the 1970s, they were, sort of violent and extreme and killing civilians, but at least they had political goals, they were nationalist, they were secular, whereas the terrorists we have now, they're irrational and religious. The interesting thing, though, is that if you go back and look at what was being written in the late 1970s, at the time, people were not necessarily saying, oh, these groups are rational and we can deal with them rationally. At the time, sort of as some of the quotes I gave you, sort of they were also saying, this is irrational, this is immoral, it's terrible. Now, sort of does it grow and become, sort of the threat is seen as worse later on? Yes. But I would say it's an example, it's a shift in degree, not of kind, that the shift had already happened in the 1970s. In terms of, is academia partly to blame because academics have not been able to come up with any coherent theories or explanations? I would perhaps suggest that the connection here is that this lack of progress is not the cause of academics not being listened to, but that this lack of progress is in some ways an effect of the emergence of terrorism as the main conceptual understanding of this sort of political violence. What I mean here is that one of the reasons why there have been this difficulty in developing concrete knowledge and developing theories that advance is that there's no agreement on how you even define terrorism. And that's because terrorism itself is an object of political contention, and it's contention over whether you can even have a concrete definition of terrorism, because that would, in order to do so, would then somehow strip away this necessarily moralized and irrationality attributed to it. And that, I would argue, has in some ways hampered the development of concrete knowledge that then might be able to be of use to the government. So I would reverse the causality there.
Yeah.
The moment when you, I'm Jeff Kressler in the John Jay Library, the moment when you identify this shift in the early 1970s, and there's also that rise in international terrorism, especially the Palestinian variety, is also a moment when the United States, or at least New York, Chicago, San Francisco, a couple of other places, are in the grip of a wave of what you call political violence. And at the time, we didn't really call it terrorism until perhaps the FALN blew up fromthe Tavern at lunch hour in 1975. And so I'm wondering whether what was happening in New York and the United States, when there were in fact hundreds of bombings, not just a couple here and there, but hundreds, had any impact on our new focus on terrorism. And then finally, I wonder if you wanted to make a comment about the Metropolitan Opera and the death of Klinghoffer.
2001, I was interviewing a very well-known historian in Berlin, and at the end of the interview, it was about Berlin and Germany. At the end of the interview, and almost as an afterthought, he said, I'm very concerned about what's happening in the United States now and what its impact is going to be in the rest of the world. 24 hours later, 9/11. Final point, if you go back to 1994, the first attack on the World Trade Center. 93, sorry. How does that fit into the equation about how we deal with terrorism in the United States? I guess the question I'm asking you is anyone really listening, or has the word terrorism become sort of a lazy label that is slapped on anything that looks like a terrorist act? And how did that play out in terms of your research?
Yeah.
You thought that the nature of the violence itself was such that unusual acts then created the label of evil. And I would suggest that it is not limited to the nature of violence itself, that there is a social construction for the framing of the way that we perceive the violence, and that it is utilized for strategic purposes to justify war and to justify attacks. And I also wonder what you say about the construction of the term violence. We don't really talk about the violence that we're doing in this country. The number of drones that the people that have been killed without even bringing them to trial across the world. It's making us look like we're the terrorists, frankly. I'm sorry, that sounds a little extreme, but where is there a conversation for that violence? There isn't, because it's left out of the media.
Anything else? Okay. No, go ahead. Yeah.
I think the word or the term that you're
searching for and described the Russians, terrorists at the end of the 1970s, nihilism, or nothingness, and Raskolnikov, the crime and punishment, Dostoevsky's treatment of him is really as an insane man who is evil. And I think it's sort of mutually descriptive. The question I have, though, is we have a semblance of some sort of effort to explain things in terms of terrorism. People talk about, in a very superficial way, about disaffected or alienated youth as being attracted to the terrorist cause. Is there any real evidence that this is becoming a more serious concern? Or are we simply dismissing this as an exercise in jihad by irrationalists?
Can I add one more? You know, the issue of what defines legitimate violence is an issue of who controls violence. So it's a question of the state. And the issue of one of the things that people have, as you noted in some of those quotes, is been so appalled about the violence in the last 30, 40 years, is that it's so pervasive and ubiquitous and illegitimate because it's outside of any sort of state influence. And I do think that there's something that's happening in the nuclear age where the access to ultimate violence is no longer potentially under the control of the state, which unleashes new ways, a whole new relationship to the idea of violence, and it terrifies all of us. It terrifies states, and it excites the imagination of those drawn to large forms of violence. And so I think that the largest historical context that we're grappling with in this sort of issue of nomenclature and knowledge and sociology of knowledge is we don't understand what it is we're fighting, but we're all in the grip of a new form, a new kind of existential threat that we really don't get.
Yeah, I mean, I think on this question, and then your question in terms of what kind of violence can we talk about, and what kind of violence can we not talk about? That's one of the key questions that drove me to do this research. I would say that sort of tracing the ways that these speakabilities and unspeakabilities are structured is crucial for understanding what we can talk about and what we can't. And the role of the state is key there, because the state is not only sort of supposedly the one who has the monopoly over violence, although as you were saying, it's actually less so today. They also, at least in theory or in aspiration, control what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence, which is the ability to define what is true, or the ability to define what is violence and what is not violence, right? So the question before about whether stop and frisk is violence, the state defines that as not violence, because they are the state and they get to define what is violence and what is not. That doesn't mean that we have to accept that, but there are questions of which actors have more power to impose definitions and whether or not people will accept those or not. And I think those are the crucial questions to keep in mind. In terms of the question about the 1970s and domestic political violence, that's a great question, and it's not one that I get into, unfortunately. I'll say that I did come across, in looking at records from the very earliest, sort of expert discourses in the 1970s, there was a tendency to sort of conflate all sorts of things. So there were sort of these lists that were compiled of terrorist acts that included violence of overseas groups, violence by domestic groups, and then even things that, like, it's not clear you would even call them violence, like somebody threw a rock at the window of a car that was parked near the Russian embassy. Or there was a nonviolent protest. All sorts of things got conflated, and then somehow they got unconflated. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's other people here who have looked at that more, but I think it's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. There's a question about the UK and Ireland, and again, I haven't done research specifically on the field of expertise there. My sense is that the expert discourse on terrorism in the UK, and specifically on regards to the Irish questions, sort of looks kind of like a hybrid in some ways between the terrorism pole and the insurgency pole, and that it's included both. But again, I would defer to others who've looked at that field more closely.
Yeah.
I think your discussion is very interesting, and would be interested in knowing how, if at all, you take it to the next level. Like you mentioned at the end, if we do think that terrorists are often rational, then maybe we would look at their underlying grievances, or maybe we would, look for ways to persuade them that the violence isn't justified, or maybe, you mentioned a few different things that we might do, and I'm just curious how you think it could or should shape the dialogue if there were to be a different perception, a mass perception of terrorists as rational but still unjustified. And in answering that, I just want to make the analogy to crime as a more common crime. So, I mean, when we look at criminals, we don't normally say, well, did they have a good reason? There are legal elements of a crime, and if they meet those legal elements, we say they committed a crime, and by definition, that is warranting some sort of penalty, and it's basically unjustified, even if there's some kind of, strategy and or legitimate grievance. And so I'm just, of course, terrorism is different because in a pragmatic sense, we can say, well, the damage being inflicted is greater, so maybe we have to look more at grievances, just from even a practical standpoint. But I'm just curious how you look at the next step.
No, that's a great question, and I think the analogy is it's not just happenstance. I think there are actually a lot of parallels between how we talk about crime and how we talk about terrorism. And I guess so. For my response, I want to emphasize that I'm not. I'm just speaking pragmatically here, right? I'm not speaking about sort of like what morally, sort of I think. But when you talk about crime, right, sort of there's two types of analysis and two types of responses we can talk about. We can talk about what should we do to the person who did that crime, right, sort of that, do we try them, do we punish them in a particular way? And then we can talk about what are the causes of crime at a societal level, right? So criminologists and sociologists can study things like, is it more likely in a society that has greater socioeconomic inequality that you will have more crime? And that doesn't detract from the fact of whether or not we want to punish a particular person who commits a crime, but it's to say that we can look at this other level and think about, do we want to have policy responses at the level of society that might make it less likely that these crimes will occur at a large rate? Similarly, I'd say with regards to terrorism, right? We can talk about, on the one hand, sort of there are people and groups who commit these acts of violence, and there's a debate to be had about what sort of response do we want to have directly to the people who engage in those acts. We can also have a debate, or we should be able to have a debate, I would argue, and this is the debate that it's been difficult to have, about what are the large-scale geopolitical circumstances in which it is more or less likely that actors will engage in this sort of political violence against civilians, or particularly in political violence against civilians that may target the U.S. And we can ask, are there policies and practices that might make it more or less likely that this will happen? This is not to say that we necessarily should or should not change our policies in, sort of in response to any particular thing, but we should ask those questions. And we should be able to discuss those questions and say, are there causes at the sort of social and historical and macro level that might lead to more or less violence of different types in the world?
The question of rational actors bothers me a little bit. You can explore motivations without assuming that people act as rational actors. Much of social science research, which ends up with very sophisticated methods and tells us nothing, is based on the assumption, is often based on the assumption that you're dealing with rational actors, so that the Boston Marathon bombers, for example, when Jessica Stern was here a year ago talking about the Boston Marathon bombers, I mean, I would not call them rational actors. Whether or not they have motivations that are based in sort of family structure and communities and sense of being, radicalized by television, and I think that is a rational can become whether one is rational or not is a very loaded and confusing word. So I think what you're suggesting conceptually is that there is this tension in the way the knowledge about terrorism has gotten constructed into a labeling of evil which doesn't allow for any kind of exploration of context or background or motivation, versus a much more nuanced attempt not to lose sight of the suffering that and as a result of the violence that that's caused, that is to have some empathy for those who suffer from the consequences of violence, but one does want to understand that larger I think that's the alternative.
Yeah, there's this notion of the rational actor, which has become very,
right.
I would say denuded of any context. That isn't what I would want to see.
Well, let's let Heather. She hasn't talked yet. Go ahead.
You talk about basically how the transition is in terms of how it was more theoretical and there wasn't really we weren't really defining terrorism. And I thought it was ironic to mention someone who had to have no background in order to work in it. I noticed for me, just from being a grad student, there's a lot of research now. There's a lot of discourse which actually argues that they are, as Dr. Schroeder said, rational actors, or they are very motivated. I read Margaret Crenshaw's book, basically depicting why these groups may be doing these things, and that there are a lot of political motivations. And then there's also, from what she was talking about earlier, there's a lot of discourse that we've kind of created our own terrorists, kind of discussing when you talk about Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and what we did and that we've created or radicalized our own people based on what we did to innocent people via counterterrorism policy. So that's becoming a lot more transparent, and that's becoming the dominant literature on the subject. And I was wondering if you've done any research looking into that transition into more recent days from the more theoretical, irrational, they don't know what they're doing, they're crazy people, versus they are very rational. We're creating our own terrorists, we're radicalizing our own people, we have our own freedom fighters going over there now, and it's, these are very organized, very well funded, and considered by, and there's a lot of research from a psychosis standpoint to be normal people that they are choosing to do this out of their own free will, and they want to do this. So I was wondering if you looked at anything in terms of studying that transition and why it's so dramatically changed from what it previously was right after 9/11, where a lot of people we didn't know about a lot of these populations that were doing this and just said, oh, well, they're crazy or they're rational. That's changed a lot of the last years.
Yeah, so I'm glad you highlighted this, that there is a lot of expert research and analysis about terrorism as, what you might call a rational act, or into terrorism as something that is motivated, that's contextualized. You suggested that there's been a shift sort of from, where this approach is becoming more dominant in the field over the last 10 years, and I guess I'm not sure.
It seems like a lot of the research, because I guess from what I understood from your talk was that, a lot of the conceptualism was that, there was a lot of stuff about them being equal people, these things, you highlighted the differences in even what our own government thought.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a lot more, whereas previously I felt like right after 9/11, a lot of it was these people are crazy, what kind of religion is this, blah, blah, blah. They took it from a religious standpoint, they looked at it from a totally different schematic, and I feel like they're looking at it now to the point where there is a lot of studies out saying, from a psychological standpoint, we've kind of created our own terrorists based on what we did to innocent Muslims that had no affiliation with terrorist organizations at all whatsoever. And now saying that we're kind of creating our own, but also that we can't really define it. So if you look in the past, you can term the Catholic Church as a terrorist organization based on what they did for hundreds of years, with the Crusades and torture and all of that. So it's interesting to see how it wasn't really used at all, but even what we did to the Indians, that's terrorism. So it's interesting to see how there was now, because 9/11 prompted the whole definition of it. So it's interesting to see why we're now so willing to take a critical look at ourselves as a Western country and how we contribute to this phenomenon of terrorism.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting things here in what you raised. I think one is, has there been a shift in sort of the public discourse, away from sort of the more extreme reactions that you had right after 9/11? Another is, in sort of the realm of expert knowledge, has there been a growth of more, sort of analysis of terrorism as a rational act? I know there's been more expertise produced generally. There have always been, and one of the things I didn't have time to get into in this talk, but which I discussed in the book, is that there have always been experts who, sort of like Martha Crenshaw and Brian Jenkins, who have tried to argue that terrorism is rational and tried to develop a, sort of amoral, in the best way, field of terrorism expertise. But I would argue they've been doing this in a situation in which they're always contending with this moralizing discourse. And so there's always been this struggle. And in terms of, sort of, is this shifting or changing? I don't know. I mean, I think that'll be an interesting thing to look at. I mean, I guess somebody raised the Klinghoffer thing, which I would say just as a counterpoint that, sort of that, at least in the public sphere, it seems still very difficult to talk about terrorism as something that we can understand. But, whether or not this is changing in the expert field or not, I'm
Remind them of the
uncertain.
event.
What?
Remind them of the event.
The Klinghoffer. Oh, I mean, so my understanding is that there's an opera now going, or that is about the hijacking of a cruise ship, I mean, actually, don't. What?
70s.
In the 70s, yeah, by Palestinians, and they threw a.
80.
Yeah, they killed this guy Klinghoffer, who was a Jewish American who was in a wheelchair, and there's an opera about it now, and there have been attempts, I think, to censor it because people think that it's too sympathetic towards the terrorists. Is that right? Yeah.
Basically, Alan Dershowitz and others believe that the Met should not put this on because it offers moral equivalency between the Palestinian terrorists who hijacked the cruise line and an American tourist who happened to be on the boat, happened to be Jewish, and probably happened to be shot and thrown overboard.
Right, so it's about the inability to understand, sort of those that we deem terrorist, I would say.
Deep.
I want to talk about the question of rationality by taking it back to its origins, right, which is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the moment at which there is a systematic debate in the West, with the scientific revolution and so on, that human beings are rational and that they are capable of applying reason to actually understand the world. Now the thing is that in the 18th and 19th century, part of what happens in the context of colonialism is that rationality becomes a particular characteristic of the West and of white people and gets denied people who live in colonized situations. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Lisa, to try to problematize this notion and the way in which this labeling takes place, to say that all human beings have rational reasons for why they do what they do. But at the same time, I know this is not your project in the book, and I think your book is excellent and a must read for anyone who does terrorism studies. But to some extent, and this is of course what I do, is how much can we study the rhetoric of terrorism without at the same time understanding the history of colonialism, the rhetoric of colonialism? Because even on the IRA question and the Irish and so on, there's been a whole historical process by which the Irish were seen as savages, right? They may be white, but they're savages, and therefore their acts of resistance against British colonialism is irrational and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you need to historicize civilization and rationality and put these in the context of colonialism in order to really understand the story I'm telling here, which I don't do in my book.
You were going to say something. Let's have make your comments a little short, and let's get everyone a chance to talk, and then you can have the final word. Okay.
All right.
I wanted to dovetail on what you said, of course. Maybe.
You could.
Okay. So I will answer to Dr. Deepak Kumar, because when you are looking at the Enlightenment, you see that you can look at the Enlightenment as a reaction. A very vehement reaction to the trauma, so to speak, of the Middle Ages and the Christian Christian Catholicism and whatnot. And when you are looking at in terms of just psychologically, when you are looking at cognitive rigidity, you see that the Enlightenment, or at least in its original form, created a fanaticism about rationality, and that is countering the fanaticism of religion. And I think that the theme, as Professor Stroger said, the theme of the religious is irrational necessarily, and the secular is rational. So we have here yet another confounding element of religiosity and rationality that intersects morality. And of course, explainability, speaking of your taboo and explanation, or rationalizability, as in how much rationalized it is. So these are just, all these intersecting dimensions.
If you believe in Sharia, you must be irrational.
What?
If you believe it, if you want Sharia law, you must be irrational. I mean, that's kind of a very concrete
But
idea that's emerged in
Or any religion. in a
Or any
sense,
religion, just
although
as
it
an
gets applied
example.
unequally,
Yeah.
of
where
course.
we got stuck is that everything can be rationalized, right? So if I explode because I believe that I go to heaven, then all the heavenly gains are a bona fide rationale for the utility function, right? So I did a rational act in my irrational religious way. So everything can be rationalized, just like everything can be explained. The question is the taboo on the explanation or the taboo on rationalizability.
I have a slightly different view that I wanted to bring up.
You need to speak up.
I have a slightly different point that I wanted to talk about, probably ask, and I thought it may not be relevant, but after what you mentioned, it's kind of encouraged to talk about it. So, if you talk about the 1970s, around the Cold War, all these countries were now under the nuclear umbrella, and there was this hysteria, right, where the other guy has his hand on the trigger, and the U.S. had 10 times the amount of nuclear weapons to destroy the world, the Russians had twice the amount of nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. And the concept back in World War II, where technological excellence was key in a battle, right? What kind of aircraft you had, what kind of filter you use, things like that. That was no longer really a point there, because with nuclear weapons, you have complete annihilation. So states would definitely have to worry about the kind of consequences of their actions that they would face. And countries have still continued to mess with other countries, right? You had the CIA fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Russians. Would that have been a direct kind of American act that would have provoked a Russian counter to that, and that could have gone into the nuclear domain? So do you think that this push of labeling these acts as terrorism and kind of taking it away from a state actor kind of a thing to just terrorism, and kind of having this taboo associated with it, and kind of saying the state is separate from these terrorists, is kind of a push towards continuing these activities but not having the consequences fall on the state?
Okay. Wasn't there someone in the back?
I was just going to ask, how long was your research? How long did it take?
Okay.
A couple of years.
A couple of years?
That's amazing. All right. So we're going to have the last word. Make some final comments.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, quickly in response to your comments, I would say, one interesting thing is that you see sort of parallel to the rise of this terrorism discourse, the rise of a discourse about small wars among the U.S. military, which I think would sort of fit in probably more closely to the sort of questions you were asking, but of course that's connected to the terrorism question. Do you want to have one last question, Remy?
Do you mind?
Yeah.
I love the book, as you know, but like next to me, I feel like maybe we are, or you are limiting the critique of the terrorism expertise. This is going to go to things that Legalizing was saying earlier. And that's something you hint at when you compare 72 and 74, right? Fascinating contrast. One shift that you note is that there's agreement that states can be terrorists in 72, but not in 74, 76 anymore, right? Which is fascinating, and to me is crucial because, of course, it's important to focus on the effects that terrorism expertise has had on the taboo of explanation, right? But we start from the premise that we all agree on who the terrorists are, right? And the way we talk about them is there's something wrong or missing because we don't see them as rational, we necessarily see them as immoral and stuff. The problem with the definition, and so my research is on the history of the discourse on terrorism and how the US specifically has tried or failed to define terrorism. The big question is the state terrorism question, right? If you start in 72, around the world, right? 72 is fascinating because of Munich, but also because following Munich you have the first debate at the General Assembly of the UN on terrorism, and of course there's complete disagreement on what terrorism is. And for the rest of the world, meaning the huge majority of member states, states are terrorists. And of course for them, Israel is a terrorist state, South Africa in the apartheid regime is a terrorist state, Portugal because it still has colonies, the US because it's bombed in Vietnam, and for them this is terrorism, right? And to me what's fascinating is the role that terrorism expertise has played, not only in deciding that that was not going to be terrorism, but more importantly in actually hiding completely, and here I'm talking about the 2 or 3 main terrorism journals, right? Terrorism, political violence, and terrorism, right? If you look at all of them, nowhere will you find any sense that there is around the world an actual argument, rational if you want to put it that, about what state terrorism is, and that for them we are the terrorists, right? Same thing for debates in Congress, right? In Congress, as I've found in my research from my Ph.D., in Congress you have debates all the time between Democrats and Republicans about that issue, right? For the Democrats, South Africa is a terrorist state. For the Republicans, the ANC are terrorists, right? There's no agreement with that, right? There's complete agreement on Israel and Palestinians. Everyone agrees that.
Okay.
Right? And of course, the death squads in Central America, right? The CIA, the State Department, in declassified documents consistently say that, of course, the death squads are terrorists, and our allies over there whom we are funding and training are terrorists. They call them terrorists. They say that they were the worst terrorists there, right? And yet somehow the terrorism experts have not even told us that those debates within the UN, but also within Congress, have actually existed on the definition.
Let's give her a chance to reply.
Yes.
Okay.
There's no way to define terrorism in a way that we can make all the accusations we've made historically without including ourselves.
One of the things we do is we have wine and cheese, and we have a chance to continue the debate in a more informal way. So, but let me ask Lisa.
Yeah, I'm just briefly going to say that's, in a nutshell, why there can be no settled definition of terrorism, precisely because the states, and in this case the U.S., has this vested interest in, excluding themselves. And any settled definition would at some point call into its orbit either the U.S. or other states that are our allies. And so it has to be purposefully ambiguous. And this is the #1 tension in the field. How do you write about something and keep it stable enough that you can write about it, but yet not too stable?
Okay, so let me remind you that we do have, looks like a stack there, 2 stacks of Lisa's book for sale, which we'll be willing to part with, and hopefully then she can, it's always a great narcissistic pleasure of an author to sign the book. I'm sure she would be happy over wine and cheese to sign any of the books you buy. And we have our wine and cheese. Please stick around and talk and have an informal conversation as long as we want to. Thank you very much, Lisa Smith.